Consciousness, spirit, God, quantum physics, magic. The communities behind these words don't agree, but could we all just be talking about the same thing? My next guest fell in love with psi research after his involvement in Project Stargate, America's top secret remote viewings research. He's since been researching the paranormal for 45 years and currently serves as the chief scientist at the Institute for Noetic Sciences. His new book, The Science of Magic, is a straight-faced look at behind the scenes of psi research and even shares how you can do your own experiments at home. Today, we're going to explore the politics of magic and scientific study of the unseen as we ask the question, is this stuff legit? This is the Curious Introvert podcast with me, Meredith. Around here, we explore taboo questions and societal blind spots. My mission, and yours, if you choose to accept it, is to inspire curiosity by exploring the nuance and paradox of our world. Please help me welcome the man normalizing the paranormal, driven by curiosity and skepticism, fellow introvert Dr. Dean Radin. Thanks for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
I love that your master's degree is in electrical engineering and your PhD is in psychology, because normally those two areas of study would represent wildly different ways of thinking. But it totally fits now that I've read your book and that your work is itself like high contrast. So what's been the cycle of resistance and acceptance to psi over the years in the scientific community?
The primary reason for skepticism is that it doesn't seem to match our models of the everyday world. And so what we're talking about then is about worldviews and about metaphysics in the philosophical sense of metaphysics. What kind of a world do we think we live in? And science is based on the philosophy of materialism, which assumes that everything is made out of matter and energy, and that's the end of it. So consciousness does not come into play in that model of reality. So when a scientist is trained, not just scientists, any academic is trained, whatever their discipline is, they go through the entire course of study without ever questioning, unless they're a philosopher, they don't question that the worldview as presented, one of material essentially, is the only possible worldview that there is. And so if somebody comes along and says, there's something strange about consciousness, it seems to have non-local properties, it's sort of quantum-like, that upsets people because it's a major challenge to the basic ideas that they have accepted actually uncritically. And not their fault, because the curriculum doesn't include the philosophy of science. So they may not have actually an idea that there are alternative ways of thinking about reality that would match exactly what we already see in science, but is actually a more expansive way of thinking about things.
Have you seen a shift in, say, like at the beginning of your career versus now, in how much of what has traditionally been considered fringe is socially acceptable to explore? Is it more or less now?
Well, yes. And so one way to see that is look at things like meditation research. So in the 1950s or so, nobody was studying meditation. It was considered an extremely exotic thing from the East, and we didn't want to have anything to do with it. That changed from the 1960s to the present. So now it's not only mainstream research, but it's paid by insurance. That's like the pragmatic way of telling that something is now mainstream. You can do meditation because it works.
And if United Healthcare is covering it, it's like entered mainstream.
There you go. So another aspect is the use of psychedelics. So psychedelics were a big thing in the 60s and then got shut down by the government because people in the government don't like people to take such things. But it has come back to a very large extent starting in the 21st century, primarily because it has been shown that some psychedelics and for some kinds of psychiatric problems are way more effective than other drugs that are available. And so there's been a big push to do additional research on psychedelics. And the reason I bring that up is because meditation and psychedelics both will give you internal experiences that say there's something very strange about consciousness that we haven't been taught in our textbooks. And so both of those together, and I can see this in younger and younger people now who are now academics, they are far more open to the idea that consciousness has non-local properties. And I'm using the term non-local in the quantum sense, where it doesn't seem to be constrained by everyday space and time. And so the moment that somebody has an experience like that, that is way more powerful than all of the scientific articles that have ever been published, because people are convinced by their personal experience. And so that has dramatically changed the scientific landscape over the last 20 years or so. I would say it's gone from this is stupid stuff that's only like TV entertainment into, oh, that's interesting. That's a huge split. It's not like I accept everything at this point, but that it's now a serious topic of conversation. And of course, there are always going to be skeptics because they haven't taken a psychedelic or they don't meditate. But nevertheless, I would say that the majority now within the academic world, especially younger academics, are way more open to these kinds of phenomena.
Have you ever had an experience with psychedelics or meditation where you experienced something unexplainable?
Yes, but that's not the reason why I got into this topic. I got into it purely out of curiosity. And so if anybody lives long enough, you'll eventually do some meditation, I hope. And there are, of course, a gazillion different forms in which people can do that. And for as far as psychedelics, I've always been suspicious about psychedelics because my friends who took psychedelics tended to end up taking basically everything and a lot of it. And I felt like internally I didn't need that. Well, it turns out that as an adult, I realized that my liver actually cannot process it very well. I have a genetic mutation that makes it difficult to metabolize certain kinds of drugs. One time I took LSD, and it lasted way longer than it's supposed to,
Oh, no.
which is not a good thing. And so I investigated it, and I realized that the mutation I have, which is called Gilbert's syndrome, which is a single gene mutation, can change the way that you process different kinds of proteins, essentially. And so it would last in my liver much too long. And so I must have intuited as a youth, I don't think I want to take that stuff because I have a very different response to it. Meditation is different. Meditation doesn't require anything other than focusing of the mind. And that, yes, I've had experiences with that suggests that some of the stories that you read about mystics who can get into these very deep states, I've had like an inkling of those states. I can't consciously go into it when I want to, but yes, I've had experiences that suggest that the stories that we've heard about mystics are not fantasy, that they're saying something that's real.
I can definitely see why, when we talk about like the politics of magical experiences, I could see why from a governmental standpoint, you wouldn't want people, as the government found with LSD and I think mushrooms even, they were like trying to kind of weaponize it for a bit. What was that, the 50s or 60s? And they found that people were like, oh, I'm going to love my neighbor and not fight in Vietnam. And they were like, oh, shoot, we got to get rid of this.
That may have been part of it, yes. But I think it was also that it was described way back when as a gateway drug. And for some people, it can lead to further and further experimentation, which ends up being really bad. And so I understand that. In addition to that, even today, that there are some people who really should not take these drugs because they will become psychotic. And it's very difficult to know sometimes beforehand, is this a good thing for you or not a good thing? For me, I sort of accidentally discovered it's simply a metabolism issue. But even in meditation teachers, when teaching a whole bunch of people over their lifetime, they will say that between 2 and 5% of people who start to meditate will become psychotic because there's unconscious things going on. And if you start getting deeper and deeper in meditation and reach those unconscious things, which may be traumas or something else, and it unleashes itself into your conscious awareness, that is not a good thing. So anytime a method is used to begin to explore the inner world of consciousness, most people are perfectly fine with that, but a small percentage, it is not so good.
Oh, that's so fascinating. When we talk about quantum physics, when I'm kind of diving deep into that, it seems like there was a lot of really great research done on all of that in the 50s. And that kind of led to where we are now, where we have the general consensus that consciousness plays a key role in our physical world. So, why is the quantum physics stuff that was learned way back then not really taught now? Do you have any insight?
Well, first of all, the leading edge of quantum physics has always advanced. There are lots of people working on quantum mechanics. What you're talking about more is about interpretations of quantum mechanics,
Okay.
because the mathematics are really good. Something like 1/3 of our world's economy is based on quantum mechanics in terms of the electronics and so on, and in chemistry and whatever. The interpretation, though, is still a mystery. It's a mystery because the quantum properties, quantum world, are so different from our everyday experience. And this is the same split between classical physics and quantum physics, and also relativity, right? So we have classical physics, which is more or less a refinement of common sense. But then you go into the macro, the huge macro world, and the tiny micro world, and it's a very different way of thinking about how things work. So this says, not surprisingly, that human experience is a special case. And so classical physics is a special case. It works at a certain scale and so on. Quantum physics is an expansion because that theory can predict basically everything that we see in classical physics too. But it's the larger world, and that's the edge of physics now, where it's continuing to expand into the smaller and smaller and the larger and larger, and we see more and more that everyday human experience is a tiny, tiny little slice of what's actually going on. So one of the interpretations of quantum mechanics was that there is something peculiar about consciousness because you needed a way to take the mathematical description of physicality, which is a probabilistic state, and turning it into the states that we actually experience, classical states. So it's sometimes referred to as the transition between quantum potentials into classical actuals. How does that happen? Nobody knows how that happens. So the leading idea within physics today is that it's decoherence, that you have quantum coherence, which is this very special property of quantum mechanics. But when it interacts with the environment and it interacts with itself and other things, it collapses, kind of, in quotes, into classical-like behavior. Because from a quantum perspective, there is no classical world. It's all quantum all the time, but the way that we perceive it, the way we measure it, it looks like the classical world, everyday world. So the question is, how do we get from here to there? Well, very prominent physicists, like John von Neumann, said, you need something non-physical to take this quantum potential state, which is basically a kind of square root of probability. It's a very weird state. You need something to take that and turn it into the classical reality that we see, that we experience. So we said, well, what do we know that's non-physical? Our conscious awareness, our subjectivity doesn't seem to have a physical component to it. So we said, okay, maybe that's it. So you observe something, and then a quantum particle will change its properties. And that's then points back to the double slit experiment, which is the physics 101 way of demonstrating that that is in fact the case. So from a mainstream perspective, many physicists will claim that this transition occurs only because something like a photon hits a detector, a physical detector, and it's the physical interaction that causes it to change its properties. That turns out not to be correct because there's something called interaction-free quantum mechanics and negative measurement quantum mechanics. These are states where photons are doing things that don't interact with anything, and yet it still so-called collapses the wave function. So I don't know why that's not taught. I mean, it's in the literature, it's out there, but maybe to keep things simple, that consciousness is not brought into the domain of physics. It's simply a lot easier to teach physics if you don't have to worry about things like that.
Well, then you don't have to ask these very big questions,
Right.
because this is really getting into exciting territory, but it's also getting into like, okay, wait a minute. If our consciousness is non-local, meaning our personhood and what we would generally categorize as a soul doesn't come from our brain activity, where does it come from? Some people can actually move things with their mind or, create, manifest. I think that steps on a lot of religious toes, don't you?
Well, I'm not a very religious person, but I understand the angst that comes about from these ideas because magic traditionally in religion has a kind of a push-pull relationship, that the idea of miracles and supernatural intervention and so on is a core element of a lot of religions. Is science doesn't like that at all because the whole history of science has been to get rid of the concept or the need of the concept for supernaturalism. So at the same time, within religion, these ideas are acceptable. Most religions will say these are only acceptable in certain contexts and or by certain people doing certain kinds of rituals. And outside that context, it's demonic, it should not be done. From a scientific perspective, you can look at exactly the same kind of phenomena and say, well, if you take a neutral perspective on this, a secular perspective about the phenomena, without all of the scriptures and things that either embrace or reject it, they still exist. It's like it's a force of nature. It's simply a phenomena that we don't understand very well yet that has something to do with consciousness, which in turn has something to do with the nature of the physical world. And so the leading edge now within the kind of research that I do is no longer that interested in proof-oriented research. Like there's enough evidence that says that the various kinds of psychic abilities are quite real. So most of the research is on process. Like, how do we understand what variables will interact and make these effects stronger or weaker? How do we understand the mechanisms underneath it? Those kinds of questions, which when you think about the trend in a scientific discipline, it means it's becoming mature. It's not mature yet. It's more like somewhere in the midst of late teenagers or something like that. But it's no longer in its infancy because we have high confidence that the phenomena exist. Now the question is, well, how do we even begin to learn about it? When it's mature, it afterwards turns into technologies. So we're not quite there yet, although there have been applications like the Stargate program that you mentioned.
Yes, which I would love to talk about because I joke with people like if they say, well, I don't believe in that stuff. And I'm like, well, the US government does enough to spend your tax dollars on a super top secret program that's now been declassified, Project Stargate, where they trained remote viewers. What was your involvement with that project?
I was involved in the research side, but I knew about the operational missions was the application of talented remote viewers to help the intelligence agency, the military, to do things that were considered important for national security. I took a leave of absence from Bell Labs, which is where I was working at the time, to spend a year on that project. I was invited, and it was like an offer I couldn't refuse.
Right.
The scientists that I worked with at Bell Labs were all considered top tier. And the same was true for the scientists working on the Stargate program. They all had traditional backgrounds, they all came from traditional kinds of work, but they were now applying that expertise, mostly physics, to the understanding of these kinds of phenomena. So immediately felt that this is top tier science happening. And within that context, in working with people who are very talented, not so much trained, but talented, naturally talented remote viewers, they were doing things that outside our building was considered to be impossible. Inside the building, they were doing it. That's like our everyday work, that these remote viewers were able to, quote, see or at least describe things that were hidden, that were at a distance, that were at different times. And more importantly, it ended up being useful for operational missions.
Did you work with Remote Viewer 001?
I did, yeah. There's Joe McMoneagle. I didn't work with him. I knew Joe. He would occasionally come to the research facilities. We were at SRI International in Menlo Park, California. He was at Fort Meade in Maryland near the National Security Agency. So sometimes those folks who were working on that project would come to visit us, usually because Ingo Swann was the person who developed the remote viewing training. He spent a fair amount of time at SRI International, so that's where they would come. So I've met Joe and a bunch of other people, some of whom are known and some of whom have never been known.
How did they find these people? How do they find the people who are naturally talented at remote viewing? I've heard Jack Sarfati talk about, being like groomed is kind of an icky word, but we'll use it. As a child, like some government people came and talked to him when he was 7 or 8, I think. Is that how they did it?
No, the people working on the operational missions, almost all of them were already in the Army. And so in the Army, if you have 1 million people to choose from, you can begin to select people based on various characteristics that we knew that would suggest, in the course when they were tested, that they might have a psychic talent. And some of the questions are very easy, like, have you ever had an experience that you would consider to be psychic? Well, I mean, in the Army, you give answers. So it was questions like that, some personality questions, a lot of it also about experience. Like Joe McMoneagle turned out to be involved in search and rescue behind enemy lines during the Vietnam War and was always successful. His team always found their person. They always got out. Everyone was safe. Well, that's an indicator that something unusual is happening because it's extremely dangerous to do that. And yet he was always successful at it. So you can start asking questions about what happens in your actual experience, especially for dangerous jobs, where you always seem to be doing really well. Well, that's an indicator. And there are other indicators like that that would suggest that people who are highly successful, not only in dangerous positions, but in positions that require making decisions that affect other people's lives. And so, as an example, when I've given talks to groups in the Navy at the level of commander and captain and up, and then when I give talks about things like telepathy and precognition, I had initially thought that they would be highly skeptical about this sort of thing. Turns out it's completely wrong. They're completely accepting of it because the reason why, especially people who have been in combat, the reason they rise through the ranks is because they were able to make the right decision at the right time because other people's lives were at stake, and they did it again and again and again. So they have a track record of success, which ultimately depended on their intuition. So they may not have thought of it as psychic, but some aspect of their knowing about what to do was consistently correct. And so you find that in the military, you find it in business, find it in the entertainment world. Every world has people who are highly successful because somehow they're able to make the right decisions again and again, even without knowledge.
What was the craziest thing that you personally witnessed during your time at Project Stargate?
I was blown away by the level of accuracy that some people can gain information that looks basically photographic about things on the other side of the world that we were interested in, but we didn't know. We had no ground truth at the time. So I was coming from Bell Labs where I was already doing small experiments and seeing interesting statistical anomalies. These were no longer statistical anomalies. These was somebody who was able to gain an impression about something that no one in the United States actually knew about anywhere. And not only anywhere in space on the planet, but anywhere in time. And so that convinced me that if it was possible to do a scientific career where that's your main focus of interest, and what is this? How can this be? That's what I wanted to do. And I somehow managed to do that for the last 40 years or so.
You must have felt like a kid in a candy shop that day. I can just imagine your expression.
I don't know what I looked like, but I do remember the feeling kind of shocked. I knew from the literature what the nature of the experiments are and the probabilities associated with it. So I was more or less convinced already that these things were real, but always statistical. And this was not statistical anymore. This was, people can do that too? Oh, okay. Yeah, so it was a little bit of an ontological shock.
Yeah. If it worked so well, why did they close the program down? I think, what, in the 90s?
95, 96, yes. One of the reasons is that the program was outed. The classified nature of it had been rumored for many, many years, but there was a Nightline program where the director of Stargate at the time and several other people in Congress basically said flat out, yeah, this is a thing. That made it really, really difficult to sustain it because it was top secret. So if you have a top secret thing and now it's not top secret anymore, it's almost impossible to continue doing it, because the reason it was top secret in the first place was to allow people to so-called cover their ass, which is a big thing in the politics, that you don't want anybody to know you're doing this, partially because the value of a secret project is that it's secret. And the other thing is that it's known to be very controversial. And in addition, there's a fair amount of effort pushed into making this seem like it doesn't exist, because that helps the fact that it does exist, right? If your adversaries are thinking, well, these people think it's nonsense, even though they're doing it too, it helps relieve some of the pressure in terms of it's being used. So are there ongoing top secret programs out there that are doing all kinds of exotic things? Absolutely there are. There always are. And then what happens, unfortunately, is that the conspiracies theories start popping up. People say, well, I heard this rumor. Could this possibly be true? Do we have space planes that can get from here to Mars in 2 minutes? Those kinds of things. Well, there's no way to know unless you're inside the program. So at least what I know about is inside the program of psychic espionage, it was very valuable as long as it remained secret.
I could also see from a disclosure perspective, I could take what we've learned so far with the progress of UFO disclosure and the points that people bring up for us not having full disclosure. I could kind of see some parallels there. Like in the UFO realm, some people feel like, okay, if we had complete knowledge of aliens and their history, it could get weird really fast, like they've always been here. They made us. There's just all kinds of stuff, right? And so let's say one of those things is true and we learn it, it would create ontological shock potentially for everybody. Now, I don't know if I totally believe that, just like as a side note. I think most people actually don't even care. They're like, is that going to pay my bills? I don't care. Moving on.
Yeah.
But for people who maintain positions of authority in religious frameworks, I could see it being incredibly upsetting. Like, let's just do a thought experiment for a minute. And let's say aliens made humans. Like we're some kind of weird organ farm. That's so dark, but it's an experiment. So we can be dark if we want to. Then what would happen to like the Catholic Church, the Mormon Church, all of the money that they get from people who it's based on having a God creator that is not presumably an alien, and so it kind of has this religious implication. And so on the side of psychic or remote viewing, precognitive, any of that sort of thing, it could create like an equal upsetting result. Well, hey, it seems like you're enjoying this episode so far. Have you hit the follow button on your podcast player? It's a free way that you can support the show and ensure that you never miss an episode. It wouldn't hurt my feelings at all if you hit pause and gave that follow button a little tippity tap. You're the best. Okay, back to the show.
Yes. And it may be that it's so disruptive that it would crash civilization. I don't think it would go that far. I think that people have been prepared by entertainment, movies with aliens and psychics and whatever, that you're right, that most people, if there were a disclosure of that type, would come to the conclusion of, well, does this mean I need to pay my rent? Or do I have to pay taxes anymore? I think people have been prepared for such a thing. It would be quite different 100 years ago. But now there's all kinds of strange stuff that you find in social media all the time. So a full disclosure may not be possible, especially when it comes to the UFO business, because I don't think anybody knows what's going on there. It's very, very different than psychic phenomena because there you can apply science, and we know through scientific methods that these phenomena exist. It simply is. So, what else is new? I think one of the reasons why the government has always been quite shy about, and by the way, the government is millions of people. We're talking about as specific people and programs in the intelligence agencies that carved out, this is top secret carve outs, which means that nobody knows, even who have a top secret clearance, unless you read in on the program. So this is the so-called black world, where it doesn't matter what your level of classification is. All that matters is that you're read in on the project. That means you have a need to know. And the number of people who knew about that project at the time, probably 100. So these are all people who have high clearances and knew about the program, of a small subset of the government. And everybody knows within the government, there are lots and lots of these projects. I mean, it's called a black projects because it's like a black hole in terms of where the money goes. In the case of Stargate, it was a pittance of money, $1 million a year, which is nothing.
That is nothing.
I mean, programs can eat up $1 billion a year in a flash. These were cheap because it involves human beings, not expensive hardware, right? We're not making a rocket to go to Mars in 2 minutes. We're using a talent that involves people, so it's inexpensive. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that it was so useful. It was a cheap way of getting intelligence information that didn't require a spy satellite that could easily cost $1 billion to make and $1 billion to run per year. Well, you can get good information from it, obviously, but you couldn't see inside buildings, whereas a psychic could. So one of the other issues that's wrapped into this is that the whole point of psychic espionage is that there are no secrets. You can't hide anything. You not only can't hide it in space, you can't even hide it in time. And so that provides a kind of tool that no other method can provide. But you think for a second, if there are no secrets, not only from adversaries, but from our own government, well, what does that do for the justice system and for politics and for every other aspect of life if there are no secrets? That's scary. A lot of people have all kinds of secrets and they don't want you to know what they're doing. So if there's a program that is unveiling secrets at will, pretty much, that is frightening. And that's one of the reasons why it was so highly classified. It's not only because of our adversaries, but even within our own government. If you have a program that says we can know anything, and a lot of people are even frightened of it now, the idea that remote viewing is open to everything, everywhere. That has, I think, a greater chance of disrupting civilization than the disclosure that, oh yeah, they're aliens. That's why I love the Men in Black movies so much, because they show that many of our celebrities are already aliens.
You can always get good takeaways from those movies for sure. So how does it work? I read in your book that there may be some sort of genetic component to having any sort of innate ability. And then there's the other step of having it developed and being able to do it when you want to do it. But talk to me about the genetic piece. What have you found out so far?
Well, how does it work? And the genetic piece are not exactly orthogonal to each other.
Okay.
They're asking different questions. On the genetic side, there has long been folklore about people who are psychic and come from psychic families. So when I was at the University of Edinburgh in the 90s, one of the graduate students did her dissertation on Scottish second sight. So Scottish second sight, we can translate into basically clairvoyance, that some people knew when somebody else was in danger or they had died or something like that. So it's like clairvoyance. And there were families in the northern Scotland who claimed that they could do that. Everyone could do that. It was passed down usually to the mother's line, but sometimes father too. So she did a hereditability analysis of these families to look over generations. Did it look like it could be inherited? The answer was yes. More recently, we were using modern DNA methods to get DNA from people who have similar claims. I think we only looked in the United States, but we could potentially do it as a worldwide thing where we find people who are psychic from psychic families, get their DNA, also vet them to make sure that they actually have some talent. And then you find matched controls. So when we did that study, it turned out to be much more difficult to find people who never had any psychic experiences, and nor did anyone in their family ever have psychic experiences. That was hard. It was easy to find the other people. So it's just another reflection that these kinds of experiences are pretty common. That it happens also in families is a little bit less common, but again, it was relatively easy to find candidates for this test. So you get the DNA, you run the full genome, and then you do bioinformatics methods to compare the cases, the psychic cases, and the controls. And we found a difference. So more recently, we've been using the data from 23andMe, and we had asked people to fill out a questionnaire about experiences that they've had, some of which were psychic type experiences. So then you can run a correlation between the exome, the protein building part of the DNA, against those experiences. And we found a whole bunch of SNPs. So SNP is a little piece of a genome, a tiny little piece that goes in, that basically fits inside a gene, a specific gene. So you look at these SNPs, and you can find that there were like 100 or 200 that were significant, one of which was significant at 1,000,000 to 1 odds against chance. So that one, there was only one like that. And so you look at the SNP and you can see which gene it comes from and what it does and all that. It doesn't seem to have anything to do with psychic ability, but that's only partially because we don't know what psychic ability is yet. So, maybe it has something to do with the way your big toe works. And so those people end up being psychic. It's not that. It's something else, probably more obscure even. So that's part of the puzzle, that some people are talented and it looks like there's a genetic component. There's also studies looking at neuroimaging, typically through MRIs of the brain. There's a morphological difference in the brain of people who have these experiences versus people who don't. And it's related to a deep structure called the caudate and the putamen, and they are both much larger than they are in, quote, normal people who don't have these experiences. So there's several angles pointing at some people are different than others. People have musical talent, sport talent, whatever. This, again, just looks like another talent, which involves slightly different DNA structure.
Okay. That sounds so matter of fact when you explain it like that. When you're saying we're looking at this, we see the image, we see the genome. But then when we remind ourselves the talent that we are discussing, it seems still so, out there. I feel like what you're saying about, well, scientifically, we know that this is a fact. It's not a big deal. Now we're just, researching what's next. I don't know. Do you think the average person is aware of this?
Well, most of the surveys show that when the general public is asked about what they believe, usually pretty close to about 50-50 on most of the different kinds of psychic abilities. I think more people believe in witches than believe in telepathy. But, nevertheless, people believe all kinds of interesting things.
That's a different podcast episode, right?
Well, belief in witches ultimately is pointing back to, are there people who are talented in this domain? They might be called a witch because they have precognitions or they have something like that. So that's a label that they get. So are there special people like that? Yeah, there are people who have these skills. So part of it is, it's a difference between asking what do you believe versus what are your experiences. Most people have had one or more experiences, which to them might seem spooky, but it fits within the category of psychic phenomena. We're talking about a large majority of people, which is why it's difficult to find controls in our experiments, because almost everybody has had the feeling of being stared at or a precognitive dream or something like that. It's just very common. The question is, how do you work with such people, especially the talented ones, to figure out how it works? And there, the only and best clue that we have at this point is quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics has the notion of non-locality, and it also suggests through consciousness that agency is important. Like, I want to do something. I'm making something happen, and I have free will to do that. And I would say in general, we have micro free will. You don't have major free will because our lives are pretty much determined by who our parents were and how rich they were and all kinds of things that determine to a large extent who and what you end up being. But nevertheless, we have micro free will. I can decide to have this versus that for dinner. And it's a trivial issue, but nevertheless, I have the agency. So quantum mechanics has agency in terms of what consciousness does, as far as we can tell. And it also has a non-local property. We can perceive things non-locally. Well, that starts to sound a lot like psychic phenomena. If those two things are actually true in quantum mechanics, and then the only question remaining is, are they true in the brain, which would give us the ability to have language and experience it and so on. And maybe experience is not in the brain. The other major theory within kind of a proto-theory or an overarching theory in psychic phenomena is that the brain is like a filter or a radio receiver for consciousness. So consciousness is like everywhere. It's part of the fabric of reality. It is tuned in a particular way so that you have a little piece of it. That's your subjective awareness, but your awareness can do things. It can perceive at a distance. It can use intention to make the world different, like manifestation and so on, to a very tiny degree. So one of the reasons I think that people get bent out of shape on this is because they have a stereotype in their mind about what they see in movies. And it's not like that. The effects that we're talking about are fairly subtle for most people most of the time. And they're tiny, tiny little effects. But that doesn't make it not real. There's a conflation between the magnitude of something and whether or not it exists. You see this, even in science, you see this. Like, it's such a small effect, why should anybody care? Well, you should care because it's real. It's part of reality. So, and you do remind people, even scientists sometimes, that, yeah, these effects are real. For most people, most of the time, they're tiny, tiny little effects that we need to do a lot of data to actually see in the laboratory. For talented people, there are larger effects.
If the effects most of the time are fairly subtle, why in, like, especially, religious circles, are there so many rules about who's allowed to perform the ritual? Like, in Christian circles, laying on of hands for the purpose of healing is considered wonderful, especially when it works. But if you went to a Reiki practitioner, that would be considered witchcraft. So if most of the time these results are subtle, why are so many people trying to control it?
Ooh. The simple answer is it's a matter of control, social control, right? If you have a flock of people who are following you, for them to continue to follow you, especially if they're giving you money, you want to maintain that control. I mean, that's really what it's about. It's about social control. In previous times, like during the Holy Roman Empire, it wasn't just social control, it was power to shape the way that the world worked. That is still true to some extent for especially very large religions, where it is not simply a matter of controlling what people believe, but power, political and otherwise. So, I mean, also there, well, what else is new? People are always trying to control what other people do and believe, largely because it gives a sense of power. And it's not that there's anything inherently wrong with power, especially used in a direction that might be considered beneficial. Unfortunately, history shows that there's more people on the side that are mainly interested in power and control for themselves rather than for the benefit of everyone else. It's an evolutionary reflection of what we came from, where survival was extremely uncertain. And so you could be eaten by a tiger at any minute. You want to gain better control over that. It makes perfect sense. But unfortunately, we're still monkeys inside. And so that kind of urge is there for most people most of the time.
I mean, when you put it like that, that does make a lot of sense. Like, should we give a bunch of hairless, violent monkeys magical powers? I'm going to say no. We should.
Yeah, that's not a good idea, even though at a very subtle level, they all have it anyway.
Oh, that's
Like we
interesting.
know, for example, psychic abilities are not just in humans. There have been many experiments with animals and even with plants to a small extent, and they show very similar effects.
I knew
So,
about the animals because I listened to the telepathy tapes mostly, and they were pointing out that dogs can sense that their owners are returning from home even when the owner is several miles away. That's a really fun rabbit hole for anyone who hasn't heard that before.
mhm.
But I don't know about plants. Tell me about plants.
Well, there's a confound with plants. Probably the most famous cases are with Cleve Baxter, who in many ways was responsible for the start of the Stargate program. So Cleve was a lie detector expert. He attached lie detector equipment to a philodendron. I think this was skin conductance, but it was looking at current flow in a leaf of philodendron. And so one of the experiments that caught the eyes of somebody in some intelligence agency somewhere, because they thought it might be an interesting form of lie detection, is that the plant's electrical activity seemed to correspond with emotions in people. So if you have a very angry person come into the room, the plant starts going crazy. Well, that's not the case if somebody comes in and they're very calm. And the other thing is that the Cleve saw that and he started doing experiments where he would have two plants in the room, he'd wire one of them up, and he would take the other plant and he would rip it apart and be very angry with it and kill it, basically. And so the other plant then, if it's sentient, can sense that that's like a dangerous guy because he took Joey and he ripped up Joey. That's not good. So the experiment then could be, well, you have the other plant wired up, it's perfectly fine, and that person leaves the room. Now, if other people come into the room, it might be a little anxious because it doesn't know how to calibrate them yet. And so there's a little bit of activity, but when that bad person comes back into the room, it goes haywire because it saw that person did something to Joey. So this became known as a phenomenon, and so it's been tested with plants and with things like yogurt, raw yogurt, and other kinds of living systems, even down at the elementary scale. And it looks like maybe there's some kind of sentience going on, which seems to be the key, that you need internal experience in order to be able to manifest these kinds of phenomena, which is why a robot, like a old style robot that may not have sentience, probably cannot be psychic. Whereas a modern AI driven robot, maybe there's a chance that it could become sentient, especially if it's modeled after brain structure, which may have something to do with sentience or not. So here we get a split, a philosophical split.
Hmm.
One says everything's basically materialism. And if you have a complicated system with recursion in it that's complex enough that it can gain sentience. I don't happen to believe that's true, but that's the leading idea within the neurosciences. That's why the neuroscience would say the brain is a very complex recursive system, and it's complex enough to give rise to awareness. Nobody says how that could happen, but then nevertheless, that's the leading theory. The other theory is, which I think is more probably true, that consciousness is part of the fabric of reality. It simply is. It is simply there. That's the way it is. From that perspective, even a very simple robot or plant or anything else, even a rock, has sentience built in because it's built out of that stuff. So that would say that our physical body is a physical thing. It works according to the quantum mechanical rules and so on. Our subjective awareness, our consciousness, what a religious person would probably say is the soul, is also part of the fabric of reality. It's not something that was generated by this physical thing. It's simply out there. And it somehow is associated with a particular embodiment. And there are, of course, strange cases of people who have multiple personalities and people who sometimes don't feel like they're in their body anymore, all of those kinds of phenomena, which are kind of pointing in the direction that that kind of way of thinking about what's going on may be true. And it's also then the very same reason why it's rejected by mainstream science, because it requires a very different model of reality, a different kind of way of thinking about it. So I lean in the direction of panpsychism and idealism and dual aspect monism, all of which have to do with consciousness as being a fundamental aspect of reality rather than materialism. mainly because of 40 years of looking at psychic phenomena and realizing that those things exist.
Gee, only 40 years? Yeah, that's pretty major. I think that puts you in such an interesting and important position to be able to comment on those things. So I hope that people are paying attention, because it seems like this work that you're doing is not about tricks with plants. It's about, like, what is reality? I mean, these are really big questions that you're asking.
Yeah. It's all about what is reality with a large R, a capital R. Philosophers have been talking about this forever and came up with all kinds of interesting ideas. So in some respects, the kind of research that I do and my colleagues do is experimental metaphysics. It really is putting to the test alternative ideas about the nature of reality. Like, what is it? How does it work? And what is our role in it? So I think at this point, one of the phrases I like is the question, what is the role of consciousness in the physical world? From a materialistic perspective, there's somewhere between little and none. I mean, during behaviorism and psychology, the answer was none. Consciousness doesn't even exist. Well, that was kind of stupid. But nevertheless, that held sway in psychology for 50 years. So the reason why I think the answer is important is manyfold. One of which is that when people have an experience of this type, just for a given umbrella, say a noetic experience, they just know something and they know for sure that it's true, whether it's a perception or a dream or whatever, they just know it. So if somebody has a noetic experience, more often than not, in almost every case, it is transformative in terms of their outlook on what they think they are. And the direction of that change, the transformation, is pro-social. They become a better person. They have more compassion and more empathy. They are more interested in serving others. All the things in a direction where you'd say, that's probably a good thing. Well, why does that happen? It's so interesting. It happens in psychedelics too. People who are taking psilocybin in clinical contexts would have a mystical experience. They would have the same transformation. They would become pro-social, like overnight. What is that?
Yeah.
Why does that realization turn us into a better person?
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons I'm interested in this as well.
If you were to summarize your hope for the culmination of your life's work, what would you say that is? Because, sir, I'm sure you've thought about it. You seem like a very reflective person. And 40 years, especially this last 40 years, has been so interesting, so different from when we started, that it must be, I don't know, such an interesting place to be in your shoes.
Well, I mean, my career is within science. A lot of science is aimed at figuring out what is the nature of who and what we are and what the physical world is about. So it's a highly intellectual kind of endeavor. It involves a lot of analysis and that sort of thing, which I like. That's why I do it. The older I get, the more I see why gaining a better sense of who and what we are is not simply for basic science purposes, like to gain knowledge. It's like, what is the purpose of gaining knowledge? Well, the answer is becoming more and more clear as time goes on, that we are in the process of killing ourselves, killing the entire planet. There are people who say it's a hoax. They're willfully ignorant to say that. I don't even think they believe it, but it's politically expedient to say such things. So it is very important that we understand who and what we are and our relationship to the planet so that we can persist as a species, among other things. And we already know that a lot of species are going extinct as a result of the way that the planet is going. So I would like to think that when I finally retire someday, the kind of work that I contributed to, because after all, it is always true in science, you stand on the shoulders of giants, and I certainly do. Well, I hope I can be a small giant that other people can stand on and say, well, we learned this because of that person, and that continues in a direction that tells us more and more about who and what we are in a way that would help everybody and everything on the planet. Because I would like to see that the human experience doesn't end badly. And so personally, what can I do about that? I can continue to learn more and more about who and what we are and about how we relate to the world. and hope that has an effect.
Well, I'm very grateful for the kind of work that you're doing, and I hope the same. I'm right there with you and cheering you on. Thank you so much for sharing today, and thank you so much for your wonderful book. Can you tell people where they can buy The Science of Magic, How the Mind Weaves the Fabric of Reality?
You can buy it wherever books are sold. So on my personal website, deanradin.com, if you go to the page that talks about books, they have a whole bunch of buttons from every bookstore where you can order it. You can pre-order or order depending on when you're looking at this. So it's sold everywhere.
Well, I highly recommend it. It does feel like a behind the scenes of how these experiments are done, but it's not so highbrow that you feel like you already have to have an advanced physics degree to read it. And I'm sure that that is intentional on your part and took a lot of work. So thank you for that.
I think, as Einstein may have said, that if you can't describe what you're doing, even in physics, to your grandmother and have her understand exactly what's going on if she's not a physicist, well, then you don't really understand what you're doing.
Yes.
So I kind of take that attitude as well, that I try to explain it in simple terms because a lot of the stuff is simple. It is made to look very difficult because of the jargon that is used, or the mathematics sometimes. But ultimately, it's all simple stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again. I appreciate you coming on, and I'll be sure to link the book in the show notes.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Since you've made it this far, I'd like to invite you to be a part of my private Facebook group. It's where I listen to what you want and do occasional giveaways. I also post in there more than I do on other socials, just, because it feels like a tight-knit group of curious thinkers. So search MFR Curious Insiders on Facebook or click the link in the show notes to join. If you like this episode, you'll also like the one with the professor of biological anthropology, Dr. Michael Masters, asking if aliens are actually humans from the future. That's episode 276. And stay tuned next week when I talk with the professor of health sciences at Brock University, asking if asexuality is an actual orientation or simply a symptom. Until then, keep it curious.